Here we go again. It's the same old bloody song and dance you can count on to occur at least twice a month. You can definitely be disgusted by it, but at the same time, it's definitely becoming more and more difficult to be shocked by this sort of thing. You know, it's amazing. You have the daily and nightly news sitting up here telling us that we need to focus our attention on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And you have this administration seeking to pledge billions of taxpayer dollars to fund these kinds of foreign conflicts. But the US just can't seem to find the time nor the resources to stop these daily slaughters of men, women, and children from occurring. Yet the white media is badgering American citizens to reserve their compassion, worry, and concern with conflicts not even occurring on American soil. According to the Gun Violence Archive, which defines a mass shooting as an incident in which 4 or more people are injured or killed, there have been more than 560 mass shootings across the U.S. so far this year, resulting in 672 deaths and 2,700 injuries. Back in 2021, there were 690 mass shootings with 705 deaths and 2,828 injuries. The worst mass shooting in the U.S. as of August 2023 was the Las Vegas shooting in 2017, which left 58 people dead and a total of 604 victims. And yet, I'm supposed to be worried about what's going on thousands of miles away. How in the world is what's happening over here any less tragic? The job of the white media on both the left and the right is not to inform the public in a manner where they're able to make the best social and political decisions. The quote, left and right media simply reflects different ideological methods of how the white status quo should be maintained. Their job is not to give the public information that will disrupt the status quo. Case in point, the white media never ever covers mass shootings in a way where it puts a spotlight on the actual root cause of why these horrific and demonic tragedies keep occurring. And the reason they don't do that is because they know doing so would involve having to examine why it is that these white guys keep feeling the need to stockpile these mass hordes of weapons and to unleash them on random innocent men, women, and children. Instead, they go out of their way to humanize these monsters. For instance, the bodies weren't even cold yet before MSNBC, CNN, and Fox were already putting out reports that law enforcement fed them that this murderer Robert Card, quote, recently reported mental health issues to include hearing voices, and that he'd made threats to shoot up the National Guard base in Saco, Maine. Even if that is the case, he sure as heck was mentally stable enough to pass the background check for him to obtain a weapon. A brief aside, do you ever notice that black people never respond to mental illness by going out and killing a bunch of random human beings? Black people who have the biggest reason to have mental illness in the first place, being that we live under a system called white supremacy, never take out their frustration by murdering scores of random people. The white media never hones in on the fact that domestic terror, which is what these mass killings are, almost exclusively is done by white males. Furthermore, there are literally no studies you can find that correlate mental illness with mass shootings. You can't find any because there aren't any, and there aren't any because this has nothing to do with mental illness. It has everything to do with pathological conditioning. The mental illness line is just a fallback white media relies on to give excuses for these mass murderers. These cowards in law enforcement, like the sniveling, scaredy cats they are, also work with social media platforms to scrub the information of these mass killers from the internet, under the guise that they, quote, need to keep the information private because it's under investigation. What a load of crap, as if the public being able to see a suspect's Facebook page is going to somehow interfere with an investigation. No, they do that because in the majority of these cases where these animals go on these killing sprees, if you take a look at what they post on social media on a regular basis or in their manifestos, shout out Peyton Gendrich, you'll find some kind of white supremacist rhetoric. The very last thing the dominant society wants is the public forming an association between mass killings and whiteness. When it comes to associating criminality with something, that's reserved exclusively for blackness, don't you know? What the media does latch onto is its constant demonization, criminalization, and dehumanization of black suspects. The evening news is littered with images of mugshots of black people who've been suspected of doing random crimes around the city. They do so daily to consistently reinforce the stereotypic notion to the public that these people are savages and not even human, and they just deserve anything bad that happens to them because they're just so inherently evil. Part of white privilege means, if you're classified as white, you're exempt from having major media outlets run 24/7 smear campaigns against the people who share your skin color and phenotypes. Not only that, if you do commit a crime, even if it's something as heinous and as horrific as a mass shooting, they'll go to great lengths to protect your image, conceal your identity, and they'll even tug at the public's heartstrings to garner sympathy on your behalf. This is just one of the many goodies and benefits white privilege affords you simply for just being born the right skin color. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right? Well, unfortunately, white privilege comes at a very, very hefty price, and deep down, white society understands that it does. But as I've said in other podcasts, white privilege is a hell of a drug, one they're not trying to go to rehab for. When you have a media apparatus that makes it very loud and clear and that constantly reinforces the notion that you can literally go around blowing people's brains out and that you will still be defended and even given the 15 minutes of fame, and when law enforcement demonstrates over and over they'll do everything they can to protect you from being punished for your crime, that just emboldens the next mass killer to run up in your kid's elementary school and start mowing people down. White privilege, aka systematic racism, is a system of degeneracy, and even though it's targeted at black people, a system so corrupt and evil is going to have spillover effects into the rest of society. By definition, if you're harming black people, you are harming your society. Serious social issues like climate change, the opioid crisis, mass shootings, wealth inequality are all in effects caused by systematic racism. When it comes to white men, they're taught all their lives that they're at the tippy top of the racial hierarchy and the social pecking order. All throughout grade school, white boys are constantly shown positive images of white men and are taught extensively about their accomplishments throughout history while leaving out their exploits. They're portrayed as pioneers who have a brave sense of adventure and who aren't afraid to go out into the world and claim their piece of the earth, while leaving out that they had to murder, rape, and steal to get their piece of the earth. In the majority of movies, the white man is portrayed as rugged, decisive, innovative, someone who leads, someone who everyone galvanizes around, and the hero who comes to save the day. Oh, and the white man always gets the girls in the end, even when a romance scenario adds absolutely nothing to the overall plot. This is done deliberately for the purpose of conditioning the masses that the white man is the epitome of manhood and masculinity, and that he should be the most desired to be with and to be like. From Star-Lord to Captain Kirk to the Cartwrights to Tony Stark to Batman, this is why you see this dynamic portrayed over and over and over again in cinema. Heck, even in the movie Hancock, the actual black superhero himself didn't even get the girl in the end. The woman who was supposed to be the same kind of being as him stayed with her regular human white husband. Meanwhile, black men's characters are reduced to being comic relief that no one takes seriously, or as the sidekick. They're pretty much expendable and non-essential in moving the plot forward. Heck, there was a running joke back in the 90s and early 2000s that if you saw a black person in a scary movie, they weren't going to be around for very long, being that they were probably going to be the first character to die. And this kind of conditioning is effective. Think I'm reaching? Why is it then that when you typically think of what an angel or Jesus or even God himself looks like, what image pops into your head? Describe to yourself how they look physically. And that's my point. They succeeded in getting you to associate whiteness with being akin to godliness itself. Under the system of white supremacy, it's these kinds of collective customs and conditioning that signal to white men that the world owes them something simply for the fact that they were born being white. It's this kind of social pampering that creates grotesquely bloated egos and inflated senses of entitlement that these white men carry. So much so, in their minds, they are gods. And if the world does not bend to their will or present every little thing their decrepit and withering hearts desire at their feet, they deserve to be punished. And guess who they think should carry out the punishment? And who's God in their minds? They are. If they're not experiencing the same kind of preferential treatment that the white guys in the movies get, they start to see themselves as victims and as those who are being targeted and shunned by the world. You see, it's not actually black people who are the victims in white supremacy. That's just all that woke stuff, and we're really the victims here. We're the ones actually being targeted. And that's exactly what Dylan Roof said in his confession after he murdered 9 innocent black people. He said that black people were just going around out here killing white people and that no one was doing anything about it. And that's why he just had to run into that church and murder unsuspecting churchgoers who couldn't defend themselves. Talk about a real, quote, brave stand on behalf of the white race. Mass shootings are the cost of maintaining white privilege, which the left or the right never does anything about. There's been no substantive pushes in Congress to regulate guns because they understand this is not a gun problem. Meanwhile, literal toddlers are being murdered in their classrooms and freaking bowling alleys. The white collective is so very obsessed, so utterly terrified of having to compete on an equal playing field, they're willing to sacrifice their own damn children to avoid doing so. That is the epitome of no longer being a human being at that point. You've devolved into something lower than humans or even animals. You become a failed subhuman organism, which is interesting because that's the label they projected on us since white supremacy's inception. Projection is a real psychological term for a reason, folks. When it comes to them getting to live in their gated communities, them getting preferential treatment in the workforce, them not having to worry about police brutality, them not having to worry about being mass incarcerated, them having better access to medical care, them getting to enjoy a nation they did not build and being able to hoard and enjoy wealth they did not generate. Mass shootings are the cost of maintaining all of that. White America is being asked to choose between white privilege or their lives, and their lives of their loved ones. And based on how this problem keeps on getting worse and worse, they've made what their collective choice is very clear. Robert Card committed an act of terror. Literally, people had to shelter in place and keep their lights off in their homes in Lewiston, Maine, when the killer was still on the loose. But I doubt the FBI will determine it as an act of terror, and it's that same kind of lax, cowardly, milquetoast condemnation that emboldens the next mass shooter. Now, black family, we live in extremely dangerous times. Not only are we the subject of this wicked system called racism, but we also have to worry about staying safe from the fallout it's causing over in the white community. Recognize and accept the fact, when you're out in public, it literally could go down in any minute. This is why it's important to have your power tool game, your physical game, your tactical game, and your situational awareness game in order. We need to make sure all of our loved ones are equally on code in that regard. We live in a country where the government has allowed the streets to become literal war zones, and we have to treat it like one, unfortunately. The days of being oblivious and aloof while out in public are over, which means we have to start sacrificing certain things to remain safe, like going to huge crowds of people unnecessarily. We know these nut jobs target large groups of people, and going to some music concert or nightclub is not worth your life. We don't have that luxury, and to tell you the truth, we've never really had it as black people. We need to keep our circles tight, and we need to learn to recognize when someone comes around who doesn't belong. Heck, one of my good friends is white, as certain white people like to say. But when it comes to associating with white people, there are certain characteristics and warning signs I check for to see if I should continue interacting with them. We need to be versed on what kind of leanings, tendencies, and mannerisms that a Dylan Ruth or a Peyton Gendron exhibit in order to get them out of the mix before these kinds of tragedies happen. Because what happened in Lewiston, Maine wasn't the first time. And until we replace this wicked system of white privilege with a system of justice, it certainly won't be the last. One love and one justice. The Stormy Poet.